Hello viewers, in this video I shall try to explain and I will also try to discuss about major literary movements in English literature which will be helpful for you if you are appearing for any interview that is related to English literature and NET English, SLAT English, or if you are preparing for MA in English entrance test including CUET. Okay, so without any delay, let's begin our discussion. The first literary movements of this video is absurd literature. I think most of most of you might have heard. So absurd literature, it was a literary movement in drama, and it started in 1930 and it lasted till 1970. This movement, it was primarily uh, rampant in theater, English theater, uh, in English literature. Okay, but it was originated in other country in Europe, and that responded to the seeming illogicality and purposelessness of human life in works marked by lack of clear narrative, understandable psychological motives, or emotional catharsis. So, in this kind of absurd theater or drama, often the works displays meaninglessness, existentialism, purposelessness, what is the meaning of life, why we are living. So that all kind of thing you will get. Okay, so you might have read Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which is one of the most celebrated works in this absurd theater genre. Apart from that, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. This is two example of absurd drama and rhinoceros. There are many more. Okay, the next literary movement in English literature is aestheticism. Aestheticism, it started in 1830 and it lasted till 1910. And it is a late 19th century movement that believed in art as an end in itself. And aesthetics, aesthetics such as Oscar Wilde and Walter Peter, they rejected the view that art had to possess a higher moral or political value and believed instead in art for art's sake. So that was the motive of this literary movement. Then another next our literary movement or period is Angry Young Men. Angry Young Men, it is one of the crucial literary movements in English literature, and it started during 1950s and it lasted till 1980s. So it was a group of male British writers who had created visceral plays and fiction at odds with the political establishment and a self-satisfied middle class. Okay, so that was their main background. Then, if you talk about example, then John Osborne's play Look Back in Anger, which is published in 1957, it is one of the seminal works of this angry young man literary movement. Okay, in most of these movements works or periods, the works are often representation of angry youth. Okay, and next is beat generation. Beat generation, it started in 1950s and it lasted till 1960s. So it lasted nearly for a decade. And it was a group of American writers in the 1950s and 1960s who sought release and illumination, though a bohemian counterculture of sex, drugs, and Zen Buddhism. Maybe true way. Okay, and beat writers, famous writers include Jack Kerouac, his famous work On the Road, and Allen Ginsberg Howl. It gained fame by giving readings of coffee houses, often accompanied by jazz music. So that was its little detail of beat generation. If you want to know more, then please search it on Google. You will get many information. And next is it is one of the major literary movements or period, there is Bloomsbury Group. Bloomsbury Group, it started in 1906 and lasted till 1930s. It is an informal group of friends and lovers, including Clive Bell, E.M. Forster, Roger Fry, Lytton Strachey, Virginia Woolf, and John Maynard Keynes, who lived in the Bloomsbury section of London in England in the early 20th century and who had a considerable liberalizing influence on British culture. So this was the Bloomsbury group. Okay, Bloomsbury group, this group or this movement had created countless works. Okay, and E.M. Forster, Virginia Woolf, they are the prominent names for this movement. Okay, next is Commedia dell'arte. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. It might be written in French. So Commedia dell'arte, it began in 1500s and it lasted till 1700. So it lasted very long. So what is Commedia dell'arte movement in English literature? So it was uh, im- improvisational comedy, which was first developed in Renaissance Italy, that involved stock characters and centered around a set scenario. Okay, that was its main motive. And the elements of farce and buffoonery in Commedia dell'arte, as well as its standard characters and plot intrigues, have had a tremendous influence on Western comedy and can still be seen in contemporary drama and television sitcoms. So that was its impact. That is Commedia dell'arte movement in English literature, which was started in Renaissance Italy. Okay, and its influence can be seen right now, means in nowadays too. Next literary movement which has huge impact in English literature is Dadaism. Dadaism, it began in 1916 and it lasted till 1922. So it was an avant-garde movement that began in response to the devastation of World War One, and it was based in Paris and it was led by the poet Tristan Zara. The Dadaists produced nihilistic and anti-logical prose poetry and art and rejected the traditions, rules, and ideals of pre-war Europe. So that was its influence, Dadaism. Okay, that Dadaism had means they were frustrated, crestfallen by the devastation of World War One, and that's why, consequently, they produced nihilistic and anti-logical prose poetry and art, and it has huge impact in English literature in many literary forms. So that is Dadaism. Next, Enlightenment. Enlightenment, you must have heard. Enlightenment, it started during in 1660 and it lasted till 1790. It is an intellectual movement in France and other parts of Europe that emphasized the importance of reason, progress, and liberty. And the Enlightenment, it is also sometimes called the Age of Reason and is primarily associated with the non-fiction writings such as essays and philosophical treatises. And major Enlightenment writers include Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean Rousseau, and Rene Descartes. I hope you have understood. This was a major and very impactful English literary period or movement. Next, next we have got Gothic fiction movement or period. Gothic fiction, it started in 1764 and it lasted till 1820. So I hope you have little idea about Gothic. Gothic, it's a little bit like horror, ghost-like circumstance. Okay, so this is a literary genre of late 18th century literature that featured brooding, mysterious settings and plots and set the stage for what we now call horror stories. So Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto, it was set inside a medieval castle, which was the first major Gothic novel. And later the term Gothic, it grew to include any work that attempted to create an atmosphere of terror or the unknown, such as Edgar Allan Poe's short stories. So that was Gothic fiction. Besides, there were many Gothic fiction, including, if I'm not wrong, Jane Eyre is too slightly a Gothic fiction, and then Wuthering Heights, if I'm not wrong, and you can do your own research. So next is Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance, it started in 1918 and it lasted till 1930. So it was a flowering of African American literature, art, and music during the 1920s in New York City. And W.E.B. Du Bois, the soul of the black folk, it is anticipated the movement, and which also included Elaine Locke's anthology, The New Negro, Jorah Neale Hurston's novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and the poetry of Langston Hughes and County Cullen. So these were the writers who had tremendously contributed in the works of Harlem Renaissance. So that was Harlem Renaissance. Okay, I hope you have understood. Next we have Lost Generation. Lost Generation, it is also a very uh, impactful English literary period, and it started in 1918 and lasted till 1930s. So this is a term, lost generation, used to describe the generation of writers, many of them soldiers that came to maturity during World War One, and notable members of this group include F. Scott Fitzgerald. You must have heard his name. His famous work includes The Great Gatsby. There is also a movie in the name of his work and based on his work. So please watch it if you have time. Then John Dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway, who was also awarded Nobel Prize in Literature. His famous works include The Old Man and the Sea, where he has said, "A man can be defeated, but he cannot be destroyed." And whose novel The Sun Also Rises, it embodies the lost generation's sense of disillusionment. Okay, that was lost generation's little detail. Next we have magic realism. Magic realism, it started in 1935, but it is still going on right now too. Still many writers, they choose to write in magic realism literary genre, and this is a style of writing which was popularized by George Louis Borges and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Guntes Grass, and others, that combines realism with moments of dreamlike fantasy within a single prose narrative. That's it. I think most of you have also read magic realism, literary period works like uh, a Chronicle of Death Foretold. Okay, I hope you have read it, and 100 Years of Solitude, like that. Next, we have metaphysical poets. It is also very important literary period in poetry. Metaphysical poets, it's their timeline was from 1633 to 1680. It was a group of 17th century poets who combined direct language with ingenious images, paradoxes, and conceits. So John Donne and Andrew Marvell were the best known poets of this school. If you talk about poetry, then we can say The Last Light Together, if I'm not wrong, and then the sun rising, the death be not proud. So these are the example of metaphysical poetry. Next, Middle English, its timeline is 1066 to 1500. I think you all know what is 1066. 1066 was the year when Norman conquest occurred. So the transitional period between Anglo-Saxon and modern English, it is Middle English, and the cultural upheaval that followed the Norman conquest of England in 1066, it saw a flowering of secular literature, including ballads, chivalric romances, allegorical poems, and a variety of religious plays. Okay. Besides, Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales is the most celebrated work of this period. I hope you understood. Next, modernism. Modernism, we all know it started in 1890s and it lasted till 1940s, and it was a literary and artistic movement that provided a radical breaks with traditional modes of Western art, thought, religion, social conventions, and morality. And major themes of this modernism period in English literature, it include the attack on notions of hierarchy, experimentation in new forms of narrative, such as stream of consciousness, you might have heard, and doubt about the existence of knowledge, objective reality, attention to alternative viewpoints and modes of thinking, and self referentiality as a means of drawing attention to the relationship between artist and audience and form and content. Okay, so stream of conscience, many writers had work on this genre, and you can take name of D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, like that. Go on. Next, high modernism. High modernism, it started in 1920s. So it generally considered the golden age of modernist literature. This period saw the publication of James Joyce, Ulysses, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time. Got it? Then, naturalism. Naturalism is one of the major literary movements. It began in 1865 and it lasted till 1900. So, it is a literary movement that used detailed realism to suggest that social conditions, hereditary, and environment had inescapable force in shaping human character. Okay, and leading writers in this movement include Emily Zola, Theodore Dreiser, and Stephen Crane. Next, okay, wait. We next what we have is naturalism is done. Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism's timeline is from 1660 to 1798. It was a literary movement inspired by the rediscovery of classical works of ancient Greece and Rome that emphasized balance, restraint, and order. Okay. Besides, neoclassicism, it roughly co in coincided with the Enlightenment, which espoused reason over passion. And notable neoclassical writers include Edmund Burke, John Dryden, Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope, and Jonathan Swift. I hope you have read most of neoclassicism literary period writers' works, if I'm not wrong. Next, what we have is Novo Roman, means new novel literary period. It started in 1955 and it lasted till 1970. It was a French movement. It was led by Hélène Roby Grillet that dispensed with traditional elements of the novel, such as plot and character, in favor of neutrally recording the experience of sensation and things. Next, what we have is post-colonial literature. It is a famous literary movements. So, post-colonial literature, it started in 1950s and it is still going on right now. Too, we are living post-colonial literary movement. Got it? Okay. So this is a literature by and about people from former European colonies like our India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, like all. Primarily in Africa, Asia, South America, and the Caribbean. And this literature aims both to expand the traditional canon of Western literature and to challenge Eurocentric assumptions about literature, especially through examination of questions of otherness, identity, and race. Prominent postcolonial works include Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, you must have read, B.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas, and Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children. Moreover, Edward Said's Orientalism, which was published in 1978, it had provided an important theoretical basis for understanding post-colonial literature. That's it. Next. Next we have is postmodernism. It is also a crucial literary movement, and it started in 1945 and it is still going on. It is not modernism, rather it is postmodernism. So it is a notoriously ambiguous term, especially as it refers to literature. Postmodernism can be seen as a response to the elitism of high modernism as well as to the horrors of World War II. And nevertheless, postmodern literature is also characterized by a disjointed, fragmented pastiche of high and low culture of the culture that reflects the absence of tradition and structure in a world driven by technology and consumerism. Uh, Moreover, Julian Burns, Don DeLillo, Toni Morrison, Vladimir Nabokov, Thomas Pynchon, Salman Rushdie, and Kurt Vonnegut were among many who were considered postmodernist authors. Okay, most of you have read most of these writers' works. Next, we have pre-Raphaelite literary movement. It started in 1848 and it lasted till 1870. So this was a influential literary movement in English literature and the literary arm of an artistic movement that drew inspiration from Italian artists working before Raphael. Okay, Raphael It his timeline was 1483 to 1520, and the pre-Raphaelites it combined sensuousness and religiosity through archaic poetic forms and medieval settings. Uh, William Morris, Christiana Rossetti, Daniel Gabriel Rossetti, and Charles Swinburne were leading poets in this movement of pre-Raphaelite. Christiana Rossetti, Daniel, Dante, Gabriel Rossetti. You must have read their work. Okay, pre-Raphaelite movements. Then we have got is realism. Realism is also a notable literary movement which had huge impact in English literary works. So it started in 1830s and it lasted till 1900. So this is a loose term that can refer to any work that aims at honest portrayal over sensationalism, exaggeration, or melodrama. So technically, realism it refers to a late 19th century literary movement that is primarily French, English, and American, and it aimed at accurate, detailed portrayal of ordinary contemporary life. Okay, and many of the 19th century's greatest novelists, such as Honoré de Balzac, Charles Dickens, George Eliot, Gustave Flaubert, and Leo Tolstoy, they are classified as realist. And naturalism, it can be seen also as an intensification of realism. So I hope you have read most of realism period works, because here we have got many names including Charles Dickens and Leo Tolstoy. They are one of the greatest writers in world literature. Next, we have got is Romanticism. Romanticism, I think you are acquainted with this literary movement. It started in 1798 when I think when literary ballads or what that poetry works were published by William Wordsworth and S.D. Coleridge. So it started in 1798 and it lasted till 1832. It is a literary and artistic movement that reacted against the restraint and universalism of the Enlightenment. And the Romantics, they celebrated spontaneity, imagination, subjectivity, and purity of nature. And notable English Romantic writers, it includes writers include Jane Austen, most of you have read, William Blake, Lord Byron, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and William Wordsworth. I hope most of you have read. Then, prominent figures in the American Romantic movement, it also includes Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, Edgar Allan Poe, William Cullen Bryant, and John Greenleaf Whittier. So most of you have read most of the works of Romanticism. Next, we have got is Strum and Drag. Strum and Drag, it was a literary movement of 1770s. So it was means in German, for Strom and stress, it means Strum and Drang. Okay, so this was the brief German literary movement which advocated passionate individuality in the face of neoclassical rationalism and restraint. And God's The Sorrows of a Young Warder is the most enduring work of this movement called Strum and Drang, which generally influenced the Romantic movement. Next, what we have got is surrealism. Surrealism, it started in 1920s and it lasted till 1930s. It was an avant-garde movement. It is based primarily in France that sought to break down the boundaries between rational and irrational, consciousness and unconscious, through a variety of literary and artistic experiments. And the surrealist poets such as André Breton and Paul Eluard were not as successful as their artist counterparts, who included Salvador Dali, John Miro, and Reine Magritte. Magritte. Then we have got is Symbolism. Symbolism, it is also a very impactful literary period. It started in 1870s and lasted till 1890s. So it was a group of French poets who reacted against realism with a poetry of suggestion based on private symbols and experimented with new poetic forms such as free verse and the prose poem. And the symbolists like Stephen Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, and Paul Verlaine are the most well-known writers of this time or of this period. They were influenced by Charles Baudelaire, In turn, they had a seminal influence on the modernist poetry of the early 20th century. Next, we have got is Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, it started in 1835 and it lasted till 1860. It was an American philosophical and spiritual movement based in New England that focused on the primacy of the individual conscience and rejected materialism in favor of closer communion with nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance and Henry David Thoreau's Walden are famous transcendentalist works. Next, what we have got is Victorian era. I hope you are familiar with this era. Victorian era is also a gigantic literary period which started in 1832 and it lasted till 1901. So this period of English history between the passage of the first Reform Bill in 1832 and the death of Queen Victoria, who reigned from 1837 to 1901. So though remembered for strict social, political, and sexual conservatism and frequent clashes between religion and science, the period also saw prolific literary activity and significant social reform and criticism. And the notable Victorian novelists of this time include the Bronte sisters. I hope you know about Bronte sisters. Bronte sisters, they had contributed many literary works, and Frankenstein. This is also one of the Bronte sisters' works. And Charles Dickens, George Eliot, William Makepeace Thackeray, Anthony Trollope, and Thomas Hardy, while prominent poets include Matthew Arnold, Robert Browning, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Gerald Manley Hopkins, Alfred Lord Tennyson, and Christiana Rossetti. Besides, notable Victorian non-fiction writers of this time include Walter Pater, John Ruskin, and Charles Darwin, who penned the famous On the Origin of Species in 1859. Thank you so much.